Hey squad, it's your Squid, and you've landed on my channel, Anxious Squid Productions. I'm an American immigrant who grew up in Australia, and this video is one for my history and education playlist. I do these history videos because before I met my American wife, I was studying Australian history at the University of Wollongong, back home in Wollongong in Australia. Those studies are effectively useless for me now here in the USA, unless I make videos like these, that is. So yeah. I have a whole bunch of other diversified content, mostly sports related, reaction videos, but truth be told, I'm trying to tweak the audio setup in my new office, and I figured this would be a good little guinea pig. So basically what I'm saying is, don't judge me based off this video. Poke around the channel, watch a couple of videos, then do me a solid and hit the subscribe. I'm trying to get to 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2020, but I can't do it without people like you who stumble across my videos and decide to join in on the ride. I'll quit babbling now though, because as you could probably tell from the title and the thumbnail of the video, this one's going to be about the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. And it's going to be about why he was undemocratically removed from power. Let's do this, squad. Thanks for tuning back in, squad. As I say in every video in this playlist, no event in history exists without a context for why and how it occurred. Before I delve into the Whitlam Dismissal, I'm going to tell you about the years leading up to his election, as well as the legislation that he enacted in his 3 short years of leadership. I think we'll all end up on the same page if we have the same information in front of us. Theoretically that is, though dissenting comments or people that disagree with me are more than welcome to drive my engagement by hitting the dislike button and flaming me in the comments section as well. Full disclosure, my grandmother campaigned for Gough Whitlam and helped him get elected, and my mother campaigned for Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, the blokes who came after him to lead the Labor Party during the 80s and early 90s. I campaigned for Julia Gillard, and I come from a line of entrenched Labor Party voters. My perspective is definitely one of a person who would to this day support Gough Whitlam and his views should they still be prevalent in the halls of Parliament House. I don't support the current Labor Party because they've completely removed themselves from Gough's vision, but that's a different story for a different video. To understand the context of the Whitlam Dismissal, you've first sort of got to understand how Australian politics works and who the people were in charge before and after him. Australia doesn't do government in the same way that they do it here in the USA. Among many other differences, there are no term limits for leadership, and our head of state is still technically the Queen. In short, because we didn't have a revolution like you mad dogs. We have a parliament that actually makes all the decisions and does all the work, but the British monarch still technically sits at the top with the ultimate power over those elected officials. The monarch doesn't act on anything in the country, him or herself though. There's a role called the Governor-General, which in a nutshell is a position within the nation of Australia that wields the power of the Queen, a de facto Queen so to speak. The Whitlam Dismissal occurred in 1975, and it was the Governor-General who dismissed him, despite Whitlam having been democratically elected twice by a large majority of the Australian population. We're talking a 67 to 58 seat majority, which translates to something like 65% of the vote. Incidentally, in the 80s, we changed a bunch of laws so that the Governor-General A had to be Australian born, B had to be chosen unanimously by the Australian government and the government's main opposition at the time of the election, and C, more. We also removed the fact that Australians were subjects of the British Crown from the Constitution on that day, which some refer to as the Red Tape Revolution because there were no guns fired, but it was a crystal clear message that Australia was removing itself from the yoke of British rule. You can thank a bloke named Bob Hawke for all of those changes, right? Yep. The Bob Hawke that my mum campaigned for that I mentioned earlier. And the reason Hawke made those changes was because he adored and idolised and admired Gough Whitlam. Hawke was appalled at the coup d'etat in the decade prior, and he was determined to make sure it could never happen again to anyone else, ever. But why was Whitlam actually dismissed? Well, the short answer is because change is uncomfortable, and the Governor-General at the time, Sir John Kerr, was an easily manipulated, foolish, feeble cretin of a man. The long answer is a little more complex, but if you ask me, it could also be boiled down to a bloke named Malcolm Fraser being a contriving, underhanded, politically opportunistic scumbag. Whitlam would forgive Fraser later in their lives, and some will no doubt make the argument in the comments section that Malcolm Fraser became a statesman, whatever that means, and he was a fierce advocate for refugees later in his life as well. But I can't muster up the stomach to praise him in any capacity, if I'm honest. Personally, I am of the belief that if you have power and don't wield it in any majorly humanitarian way, then get out of power and hypocritically preach about how the next guy should do just that, well, that's not what I'd call a positive attribute, you know what I mean? I'll acknowledge here that some people believe the CIA were in Fraser's ear at the time too, but there's no substantial evidence to support that, so it's not a track that my train of thought usually runs on. I'll get to explaining the historical reasons for the dismissal now that I've had my two digs at the two men who I feel were ultimately responsible though. As I mentioned before, Australia doesn't have term limits for its prime ministers. From 1949 until 1972, the same political party had been in power. For over 20 years, there was no change in government, no progressive action taken because they were a conservative party, and they had a commitment to a consistent gerrymandering policy in order to maintain power for their party. Gerrymandering is the shifting of district borders to strategically manipulate vote totals, in case you were unaware. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'd hazard a guess it's probably a thing here in the USA as well. For the first 18 years of their political prominence, the leader of the party, and therefore Prime Minister, was a dude named Robert Menzies. Menzies is a man who is far too fondly remembered by history, in my opinion. He rode entirely on the coattails of the foresight and the leadership that had been wielded by John Curtin, who I have a video on in my history playlist, and Ben Chifley, who were Labor Party Prime Ministers of Australia in the late 30s and 40s. As far as I can tell, Menzies' only achievement was longevity. Menzies retired in 1966 and he handed over the reins to his second in charge, a bloke named Holt. Holt would go for a swim at his local beach only 1 year later in 1967 and his body would never be found. He became the third Australian Prime Minister to die in office. Something I expect most of the country's progressives wished would have happened to Menzies about a decade prior, just saying. But incidentally, Holt drowned, right? And now some of the government-funded swimming pools are named the Harold Holt Memorial Centres, right? So the Prime Minister drowned, and Australia's response was to name some swimming pools after him. That's potentially one of my favourite fun facts from Australian history, I reckon. When Holt died, the office was taken over by 3 or 4 different blokes, one after the other, none of whom could even hold a candle to the already low bar that had been set by their predecessors in terms of leadership. This rapid shift in supposed leadership culminated in a man named Billy McMahon leading the party into an election in 1975. Incidentally, Billy McMahon was the father of Julian McMahon, the Australian-American actor who played Dr. Doom in the original Fantastic Four and Balthazar in the TV series Charmed. When I worked as a mover back home, we moved Julian McMahon, and he let me keep the certificate signed by the Queen from the swearing in of his dad as Prime Minister as a tip, because I'd been so enamoured by it when I picked up the frame, right? And because I don't think they had a very good relationship anyway. He tipped everyone else who'd worked on the move about $200 each, mind you. He was an absolute champion of a person. His dad, Billy, not so much. He would go on to lose the election in 1975 to Gough Whitlam. Alright, so we've covered the 20 years of ineptitude prior to Whitlam's election. Now, let's talk about his 3 years in power, right? And then I'll finally get to the dismissal, I promise. Thanks for sticking with me here. I'm leaving out the wider global context, right? The year was 1975 and the entire world was changing after all, but in the interest of time, I'm sticking to Australia. Gough Whitlam swept into power with the now famous political campaign referred to as the It's Time campaign. The It's Time campaign pretty much did what it says on the tin, right? And it advertised and pushed the fact that 20 years with one political party in charge was pretty ridiculous and that it was time, finally, for a change. Once in power, these are a few of the things that Whitlam changed or enacted. Remember, he did all of this within 3 years after 20 odd years without substantial social action during the Menzies, Holt and McMahon leaderships. Gough Whitlam and his team got rid of military conscription in Australia and withdrew from the Vietnam War. Whitlam got rid of the death penalty in Australia. Whitlam enacted universal health care in Australia. Whitlam enacted the single mother's pension in Australia. He made it so that legal aid would be government funded if you couldn't afford an attorney yourself. Whitlam made university education free for all Australian citizens or paid for by the taxpayer. He enacted the very equality laws we still enjoy today, dictating that the employers had to pay women and people of colour the same as you would have paid a white man for doing the same job. He created and funded the family court system. He established needs-based education funding so that the high-earning private schools would no longer get the same funding from the government as the poorest and solely publicly funded ones in lower socioeconomic areas. Geez, it would be nice if we still had that funding model today. Just saying. He reduced the voting age to 18, and he ditched God Save the Queen as well as Australia's national anthem. He granted native title land rights to Aboriginal people, and he established the National Art Gallery of Australia. He created the publicly funded youth radio station that's still running and is now known as Triple J. He recognised Papua New Guinea's independence for the first time, thus removing Australia's administration from the now independent country, the equivalent of America giving Puerto Rico independence right now, for example. And those are all just off the top of my head, right? Like, he did a whole boatload more stuff that I could find with a Google search if I really, really wanted to, and that you should. I'm wary of overselling the bloke though, as it is, right? I'll say it again, he did all of that across the space of only 3 years in power. One of the shorter tenures in Australia's leadership, but hands down, the one with the most positive and lasting effect for Australian citizens, in my opinion. Australians still benefit from legislation that the Whitlam government enacted today, over 50 years later. Can anyone name an achievement by Menzies with over 20 years in power that could parallel even half of the ones I just listed? I mean, I don't think you can, but I'm willing to let you try in the comments section if you want. As I said, drive that engagement, baby. Unfortunately for Gough, there was a large portion of the population that was more worried about the financial bottom line and the fiscal state of the country than the actual people living within it. Something Americans probably won't find too foreign a concept under President Trump's leadership at the moment. And this is where Malcolm Fraser and John Kerr come in, right? The two men I lambasted earlier for being scum of the earth. Fraser was the opposition leader. He'd beaten Billy McMahon in a leadership challenge after McMahon had lost the election to Whitlam in 1975. There was a fair bit of red peril globally, or anti-communist fervour at the time, and Australia was no different. Whitlam wasn't a communist, but I will admit that enacting sweeping social welfare programs right at the height of the Cold War was pretty brazen of him and could easily have had him tarred with that brush. This is why conspiracy theorists like chucking in the CIA in the mix here, but like I said earlier, I don't buy into that. You're not allowed to lobby the Governor-General anymore, that's now illegal. He or she has to make their own mind up without influence from either side of politics. But yeah, Fraser lobbied Kerr to dismiss Whitlam on the basis that he was spending too much money and his social welfare programs were alarmingly close to what could be considered communist or something along those lines. Admittedly, I am biased because I grew up in a household where communism wasn't a bad word, right? Any intellectual or political historian from either side of politics could not in any way ever describe Gough as communist though, regardless of that bias that I might be showing. Much in the same way they shouldn't describe Bernie Sanders as one now in the US, come to think of it. Social welfare is not communism, and you need to do your research if you think it is, right? But I digress. Fraser lobbied Kerr, and Kerr sacked Whitlam, giving power to Malcolm Fraser and his political party without the need for an election. I'll include a snippet of a recording of Whitlam's speech after the dismissal at the end of this video, because thankfully it was during an era that believed in archiving, and we've still got the footage, right? But that's all the context we really have for the Australian coup d'etat, my friends. The British monarchy, still to this day in 2020, has not declassified the documents and the decision-making process of the Governor-General, John Kerr, back in 1975. The Queen and Kerr exchanged what are now known as the Palace Letters in reference to the decision, which are held confidentially under lock and key at the National Archives in Canberra, and are, ridiculously, considered as personal rather than Commonwealth records. This enables Kerr to place his own conditions for access on them, thus avoiding the usual requirements for public access to the records in the National Archives. They can stay classified forever, basically, on his say-so. And I'll leave it there because I have to, as there isn't much more that can be said about the topic that wouldn't just be speculation, right? I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts and speculations are of this story from Australian history in the comments section. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, I'm trying to get to 5,000 subscribers before the end of 2020. So jump on board, join the squad, hit subscribe, join in whatever way you can, right? As always, I'll see you when I look at you folks, and you'll see me when you look at me. These are my patrons. Thanks for watching. Here's Gough, I guess.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General. The proclamation, which you have just heard read by the Governor-General's official secretary, was countersigned Malcolm Fraser. Who will undoubtedly go down in Australian history from Remembrance Day 1975 as Kerr's Kerr.